All right. Welcome, tremendous spirits, to the next session, 15 of Sessions of Spirit. I'll do my quick recap because we pack a lot into these next 30, 40 minutes. So in the first session, if you weren't with us before, we talked about how Hegel was the greatest philosopher because he was unselfish and sort of went through 3,000 years of philosophers and put them into a concrete totality. Session number 2 was about, for 200 years, philosophers didn't understand what he did and put him into a one-sidedness and didn't treat him as profound as he is. Session number 3 was about, once you grasp Hegel, you understand this profound insight that the dialectic is metaphysical. And once you grasp it, it empowers your practical spirit to change the world. Session 4 is that you have to get beyond the stereotypes of Hegel, that he's a totalitarian, a sexist, or a racist. That's just the first negation. There's a more modern second negation. The 5th session was about starting at the beginning of Hegel's system, and you have to grasp this concept of the circle of reason to grasp the profoundness of him. The 6th session was about how when you get to the end of the circle, it looks religious. And in genuine philosophy, philosophy is the sublation of religion, not just that first abstract negation, due to this holistic universal logic. Session 7 was about winning a Nobel Peace Prize with this universal logic by putting it into modern notation. The 8th session was how this universal logic starts with polemics, or the first negation. But the 9th session is about how the truth of the polemic is the polemic of polemics, or sublation, the negation of negation, as genuine refutation. The 10th session was a masterclass in this sublation that Hegel does in his Science of Logic, and we're going to put it into modern notation again. The 11th session was about how the profoundness of the Science of Logic isn't grasped. It is literally the ineffable moving itself, communicating itself, such as the Tao and many other religious symbols tried to communicate. The Nobel Prize is not a practical joke. The 12th session was about how this universal logic has to be living, and the purpose of it is to liberate our minds and individual spirit. The 13th session was about how this individual liberation turns into a collective liberalization, because everybody's infinitely valuable. And that's the greater purpose of life. And then the 14th session last time was how we, what did Hegel really say? And he said a lot about God and reconnecting to our soul to liberate our spirit as sort of the children of God, living in this absolute freedom. So today's session is called 15 SOS. It stands speculatively for Sessions of Spirit, but also Save Our Souls, because the pandemic has exposed a lot of fissures in our global society that we should fix, and philosophy is here to do just that. The title today is called The Absolutely Profound. As usual, I'll read the one paragraph summary. It goes, Kant is a famous philosopher who many believe Hegel is but an extension. But the truth is that Hegel was more Kantian than Kant. Hegel says that there is a great profoundness to Kant, but that Kant himself placed the profound perpetually out of reach of the subject. Kant was but a subjective idealist. Hegel transcended Kant and showed that Kant was repeating the same mistake as the roughly 1,000 years of Scholasticism, starting with John Scotus Erigena, but also forming with Anselm and finally ending with Buridan. The truth is that the absolute is absolutely attainable. The unknowable noumena of Kant is that which we know so well that it hides in plain sight. The perpetual beyond and its bad infinite is finally overcome, and not merely objective idealism, of which we have to have the negation of subjective idealism, but absolute idealism itself, the only genuine philosophy. Let us get into the essence notes now. Part 3, the dialectical unfolding. So where we left off last time was a bit of a bombshell. If you are in abstract one-sidedness, you might not have been able to endure the session. The people who were there, who were atheists, might have to watch this video, because last time what we said that Hegel was really saying sounded very religious. We talked about soul being the foundation for spirit through this Golgotha of spirit that eventually allows us to reconnect with our soul and then become children of God. You're like, what? WTF? Is this the way to freedom, really? And this group, these sessions are posted on the analytic philosophy group, which is generally known to be more atheistic. and more logical, and religion is seen to be irrational and illogical. So there might not be very many people today, but today's session is to show that no, the truth is absolutely profound. It includes everybody. So I'm going to build this case very quickly. If you look at point number 2, I talk about the sublation of Protestantism into finite science and then Descartes. The reason why this is important is because Hegel proclaimed himself openly to be a Lutheran Christian. So of course, anybody that reads him directly is going to say, oh, this guy's religious, I'm an atheist, or I'm a polytheist, or I'm something else, and I can't read this guy. So how do we make sense of this? How do we include atheists and everybody else in his genuine philosophy? Well, we're going to show it. We're going to show how Protestantism sublates into finite science and Descartes. If you think I'm cherry picking, because that is a problem with Hegel, especially with scholars who want to see him in their one-sidedness, this session is to show the two-sidedness, the true dialectical freedom. I hope to do a good job, but if you'd like to follow along with my real paper about this, it's on that link there, and it's called Continuing Hegel's Praise of Purifying Christianity into Genuine Philosophy. There's also another title called Hegel, The End and Fulfillment of Religion into Genuine Philosophy. So these are a couple of paragraphs that I took straight out of Hegel, and I'll explain them to you how I meant them in this paper. And we're going to do an evolution that I think atheists, Christians, anybody will start seeing their truth in. But this is for the atheists right now, to help them realize that I am seeing their truth, and a true speculative philosopher can move between these sensuous symbols and these one-sided modes, because you're operating with that universal logic, that continuous sublation, that master class of ideal thinking. So let's begin with the first paragraph here. I underline the portions that hit the crux or the essence of the point that I'm making with this. So this is Hegel speaking from his History of Philosophy. He says, not only have all this finality, externality, unspirituality, this formalism of scholastic philosophy been on the one hand discarded, and with justice, but on the other, the philosophical development of the doctrines of the church has been also set aside. And this is done in connection with the very fact that the subject is immersed in his own heart. This immersion, his penitence, his contrition, conversion, this occupation of the subject with himself has become the moment of first importance, but the subject has not immersed himself in the content, and the earlier immersion of spirit wherein has also been rejected. Even to this present day, we shall find in the Catholic Church and in her dogmas the echoes, and so to speak, the heritage of the philosophy of the Alexandrian school. In it, there is much more that is philosophic and speculative than in the dogmatism of Protestantism, even if there is still in this an objective element, and if it has not been made perfectly barren, as though the content were really retained only in the form of history. What are you saying right there? It sounds confusing. He's a Protestant, but he's actually praising the Catholic Church. So why is he doing this? It's because if you read his History of Philosophy closely, he's actually scolding religion right now. He's scolding scholasticism, and he's saying there's something wrong with it. Even though we were talking in a very religious mode in last session, Hegel also goes to the opposite side of the dialectic and shows its limit. Why does he do this? Why does he call it scholasticism? So why does he do this two-sidedness? He's pointing out, he's trying to preserve what's right in religion, but he's also trying to find the limit to sort of cancel just the limit to preserve the truth and then raise it to a higher unity of understanding. That is the logical movement of sublation that we covered last time. It has three logical parts, like every logical move, right? A preservation, a cancellation, and a raising to a higher unity. So he's doing that here with Catholicism and Protestantism, and he's saying the good thing about the Catholic Church and the way it's dealing about philosophy is that there was some Alexandrian philosophy in it, which was some Neoplatonism. It was Aristotle's syllogism. They were actually dealing with some real philosophical concepts, but there was also something wrong with the way they were doing it. But this is what they had that Protestantism didn't really focus on and kind of lost. There was a dogmatism to Protestantism. So even though we can talk about the absolute, God, these types of things in the religious mode, the way you do it is important. You have to have this living fluidity. And the opposite of a living fluidity to your thinking is dogmatism. It's where you have this rigid, unquestioning, it's oppressive, right? You can't engage with it deeply. You have to take it as revelation or accept it as it is. And so even though Hegel identifies as a Protestant, he's actually pointing out a limit, even in the early beginning of the session, to Protestantism. The connection of philosophy with theology of the Middle Ages has thus, in the Catholic Church, been retained in its essentials, in Protestantism. On the contrary, the subjective religious principle has been separated from philosophy, and it is only in philosophy that it has arisen in its true form again. In this principle, the religious content of the Christian Church is thus retained, and it obtains its confirmation through the testimony of Spirit that this content shall only hold good for me in as far as it makes its influence felt in my conscience and heart. So he's saying that there is a separation going on between the religious principle, the absolute, and between philosophy itself. So religion is not philosophy. It will come to its truth in philosophy, though, in its true form, and the true form is pure thought. Religious thought is trapped in this sensuousness, which we'll cover a little bit further here in the next paragraphs. But you can see at the very bottom, I underlined, only hold good for me in as far as it makes its influence felt in my conscience and heart. So what he's saying is preserved in Protestantism is that you go inwards. There's an inward movement, and that this inward movement is what the Catholic Church is lacking, because they've always made the God, the absolute, the beyond. And Kant also does this, which we'll cover at the end of the session. He also makes the absolute a beyond, something you can never actually know. And Hegel doesn't make this mistake. And Protestantism was the first turning point in the religious mode of consciousness. We're not yet in philosophy. We're still kind of in the last session talking about God, spirit, soul, sensuous symbols that are supposed to represent the supersensuous or the pure modes of thought. So this kind of inwardness is good, but there's also a bad part to it. Your conscience and your heart is only the beginning of this faith that we talked about last time, the faith that the world is truly rational. And in religious consciousness, they said this was the highest. You know, your connection to the absolute truth begins with faith and it sort of ends with faith. You have to feel it, and you can't know it, so don't try and think it, because it's perpetually beyond your own finite sinful thinking. The religious mode constantly perpetuated this, but at least Protestantism tried to make you have a direct connection. And then Hegel says, of course, to explicate that is what spirit is. You come out of your soul, out of the implicit totality of everything. You come out of your soul and you actualize these divine thoughts, these absolute pure thoughts in yourself. So we're still talking in the religious mode of consciousness here, but let's move on and say that you can't stay in your conscience and your heart. It's just the beginning. You have to explicate it. This is something that Protestantism couldn't really do with their dogma, because they were getting rid of the true philosophical tools of universal logic, which the Catholic Church at least was trying to engage with. So you can see that they're missing something. And Hegel's going to purify it here with, or starting with Descartes. So after we go through the scholastic period, we get this kind of revival of the finite sciences, which was what they were doing in ancient Greece. They were starting to think more systematically with Plato and Aristotle and empiricism. But he says real philosophy comes after even this revival portion, where we have Bruno and we get to Descartes. For Hegel, Descartes is where we get this fundamental sublation, this actual new quality emerging. We're not just doing this bad infinite, which was happening in the 1,000 years of scholasticism. That's why he said it was barren, it was monotonous, because in the bad infinite, that's part of the science of logic, that universal logic. You think you're doing a new quality. You think you know you're embodying a new quality, but you're just repeating it, because your beyond is actually not a real beyond. You have to be immanent to yourself. The logic is immanent in you. It's in your soul. You just have to bring it out. So if you make it beyond, you can never reach it. You'll just keep trying to transcend this limit that repeats. So he says, we stop this after Protestantism. Protestants, even though Hegel declares himself Lutheran, a Protestant, he says that's not enough. You have to go beyond even that. And this is where people in the religious mode of consciousness won't understand the rest of this lesson, because they'll be stuck in their fixity, their one-sidedness. Just like the atheists last session were stuck in their one-sidedness and couldn't make it with emotional resilience to this session to see their truth become sublated. And this is the problem in our culture today, is this neurotic, we don't listen to each other enough because we don't have the emotional resilience or the spirit to sort of stay with each other on the full freedom of the dialectic, the full spirit of the freedom of dialectic, because our inner children are so wounded. So here it is, Descartes, for Hegel, is where philosophy reaches its own native soil. And we know that it's, well, he says his own, the native soil of philosophy is pure thought itself. This took me a very long time to grasp. I'm going to give it to you straight. There's two realms. That kind of sounds religious at first. Religion was trying to approximate this. There is this sort of pure thought realm where there's no sensuousness. There's no you can't sense anything like your taste, your touch, your five senses, your hearing. None of that stuff exists in this first realm. This is the super sensuous realm. This is what religion was calling heaven, or the nirvanic realm outside of samsara, or the realm of gods, or there's many names in history for it. But what you need to grasp in the philosophical sense is that this is the native soil of real first philosophy, what Aristotle calls first philosophy. It's where the logic lives purely by itself. You don't need to think it. Nobody needs to think it. It thinks itself. It's in itself in a spaceless, timeless sort of void. But the void is filled with these perfect sort of universals, which we, our own thinking, connect to. But when we start with Descartes, we don't know that yet. Okay, so we're just getting to the pure thoughts themselves, the distilled principles, and they're not really connected together in that concrete totality, which is what we saw was good in the last session. Real philosophy is about the whole, what we call God, or the theory of everything, right? It is about that. If you're not doing that, you have abstract philosophy. You're working in silos, and you're not seeing the infinite interconnectedness between things. The infinite interconnectedness is the concreteness. That's what real philosophy is doing, to have that sort of freedom of thinking where you're not trapped in that one-sidedness. A lot of people won't want to believe this because there's been a huge debate between the right Hegelians and the left Hegelians, the conservatives, the religious, and the youthful, and the progressive. And they don't want to, they read Hegel in whatever way they want. I showed last time that you can read Hegel in this religious way, and it makes total sense because the underlying dialectical logic, the essence, can be in that mode. It's just sensuous. Now we're showing the opposite. We're saying you can do it super sensuously as well. So you have the super sensuous mode, and then you have the sensuous mode, which is the realm that we're familiar with. It's the realm of finitude. It's the realm where you can see things and time moves linearly, and all the familiarity of our current lives is in this realm. But we don't realize in ordinary consciousness that this realm of pure thinking is what our mind is. We think it's just like us moving around randomly. It's actually a reconnecting back to that first super sensuous realm. Those pure categories are coming through the sensuousness of nature and making you rational so you can structure the world to interpret it so that it belongs to you in some sense, while at the same time, it is the limit of your reason is also the limit of your belonging in the world. So here we have Hegel in the paragraph saying, directly quoted from his History of Philosophy, what I just said. He says, I'm going to read only the underlined part because we're running out of time. Philosophy in its own proper soil separates itself entirely from the philosophizing theology, entirely, in accordance with its principle, and places it on quite another side. So he's not mincing words here. He's actually saying there's an entire new quality. So that means philosophy, this pure thinking separated from sensualism, leaves not just Protestantism behind, it's leaving the whole religious consciousness. It's a big sublation. We are moving into a whole new realm, but it's not an abstract negation. Okay, so the absolutely profound doesn't just get rid of religion. Religion played a necessary and an important role that we later cycle back to on the circle of reason, except in the form of genuine philosophy. So instead of having religion formally, which has this sort of sensuous trappings that limit the pure logic, once you grasp the pure logic, you still can't get away from sensuous. You actually circle back around and you have the religion of philosophy instead of the philosophy of religion. And once you have that, it becomes more artistic and more beautiful. So for the religious people in the group, don't think that we're making the same mistake as history. This is a new spirit where everybody belongs, but it's this universal logic that's the essence that's going to bring us into this ideal thinking and a deeper connection with ourselves. But this is the atheist moment. This is the moment on the circle where their truth is. But it's the truth of, you might call God, as a super sensuous sort of being that is infinitely connected. what we call kind of modern science in its chopped up form. Okay, so we're now transitioning into genuine philosophy. Descartes makes this transition because he said, I think, therefore I am. So he performed what we covered in the first sessions, this sort of absolute negation. I can't trust my senses. I can't trust anything in this world. He was trying to get to that first super sensuous world. But he made a mistake, Hegel said. He assumed that the self, us, needed to exist to do the thinking. But that's an assumption. Why do you need a self to think the thoughts? What if the thoughts thought themselves? And Hegel goes past Descartes, and he actually says an absolute negation doesn't just cancel your finite knowledge, it cancels your finitude itself. You have to cancel the entire realm of nature to get to the infinite supersensuous realm of the pure thoughts thinking themselves in the native soil of philosophy, which is just pure logic itself. Okay, this is pretty interesting, right? We're starting to see speculatively how religion and philosophy sort of play together in a greater reasoning. That's why you can speak with the religious mode like I did yesterday, and I could do it as if, everybody believed I was just purely only one-sided in religion. He has to be a Christian, he has to be religious. Oh my goodness, God, children, he's quoting, passages from the Bible. It's like, this guy can't be a real atheist. But the reality is, I'm more atheist than an atheist, and I'm more religious than a religious person, more Christian than a Christian, more Buddhist than a Buddhist. You're more than everything because you see the limit. You see the truth, so you are it. You're not pretending. You're not a wolf in sheep's clothing. You actually do believe the truth in that moment. But you see the limit. Why? Because we grasp sublation. Because sublation has those three moments. So you see the truth and you embody it really. You really believe it because you see the logic in it. You see the limit, you cancel the limit, and you raise that new quality. So you can be more than the limit. That's why you can be the thing and be more than it. The mistake that people make is they always talk from that first negation and say, no, I'm not religious, I'm something else. No, I'm not this, I'm something else. It's the either or thinking. And what sublation starts to do is it does the and thinking. You're this and this, you're this and this, and you build that circle of reason. To show a perfect example of this, and a really tricky philosopher that many Hegel scholars talk about, that really muddles this discussion, is how Hegel talks about this guy in point number 4 called Jacob Bohm or Jakob Bohm. He was a German philosopher that was a guy that made no sense from the outside. Jacob wrote in a very sensuous manner, but Hegel called him the first genuine philosopher. And you're like, well, what are you talking about? When you read his philosophy, it's pretty intense. It looks like you're reading something straight out of the occult, straight out of a weird kind of Bible. It just, how could this be philosophy when we just said Descartes was trying to get us towards these more rational principles of pure thought, which got us away from sensuousness, right? We're returning to the realm of pure thought, pure logic. Well, it's because the sensuousness doesn't really matter. The sensuousness is the art. Underneath these symbols that we're using, you can still have the dialectical logic permutating the symbols. And that's what Hegel says Jacob was doing. He was saying, if you look at the quote now, I'm not making this up. This is actually from Hegel's Science History of Philosophy. Directly, he's saying he doesn't have the notion, but underlined here says, so far back in intellectual culture. He doesn't have the notion because he's so far back in intellectual culture. Jacob was an uneducated man. He was struggling to take the immensity of his speculative thinking. He was doing what Hegel was saying, right? He was doing the same thing, but he didn't have the education because he was a shoemaker. But when he was trying to write out his philosophy, the people who could recognize the logic in it gravitated to him, and it was very kind of controversial. Because Hegel had the universal version of this, he could see directly what Bohm was doing beyond the sensuousness. He could see the real symbols. So you can see the problem with Jacob wasn't that he didn't have the dialectical universal logic inside him. He just couldn't communicate it. So he says this here in the second underline. He grasped this movement, this essence of spirit in himself, in his inward nature. The inward nature, remember, is that reconnecting with your soul that we talked about last time. It is this realm of pure thought going into yourself skeptically and pulling out this rational thinking. So this is just Hegel repeating what I just said. He was grasping the movement. But then the third thing I underlined here was Bohm's great mind is confined in the hardy knot, in the hard, knotty oak of the senses. So this is where we're seeing that separation between the two worlds, right? Supersensuous and sensuous, the being of nature. It's irrational. And this is kind of what ordinary thinking can't get out of. And education, proper philosophical education, is supposed to help you separate them, not cancel them, separate them so you can think clearly through them and know which is which. So Boehm couldn't really do that, but he was trying very hard, and he wasn't able to arrive at the free presentation of the idea. The idea is that concrete totality that we were trying to talk about yesterday as God, right? The idea is the infinite connected science in the supersensuous. This is what we're trying to approximate even in modern science today. So that's how you're supposed to think of Jacob Boehm. He's straddling both worlds. So that's why religious people love him, and atheistic philosophers have a hard time. But they're like, well, I see a lot of truth in Hegel scientifically. Why is he praising this guy? Now you know this fundamental difference between supersensuous and sensuous. It's the critical moment between the sublation of religious consciousness in general, not just a religion, all of it, and real philosophy, genuine philosophy. Okay, let's move on to point number 5. If you want to think about these religious terms in terms of like modern science or a more atheistic secular science, point number 5 talks about the soul that we were exploring last time, as a sort of like this isn't Hegel, this is me. I'm just saying that you can talk about like a hologram. So in a hologram, in the holographic image, you kind of, every part has the image in it. So when you shine light through it, it can recreate the entire image. That's kind of what the soul is. It's like this monad of monads of Leibniz. If anybody knows who Leibniz is, it has the total. It's like the whole in parts. The parts are in the whole and the whole is in the parts. That's kind of what the soul is. It's like an instantiation of the absolute idea, the concrete totality. Point number 6, Hegel does make some comments on astrology and superstition. And this is where the atheists in the room will like this, because he says, he shows the limit of it. He says, if you get too wild with this stuff, you can make connections with anything. And you can, that sensuousness, that caprice, that contingency in your sensuousness that you get from the first world of nature and not the supersensuous world of logic and reason or pure science, then you can fill these connections with you know, at the end here, he says, you know, political fraud, imagination, anything you want. And we used to do this in the past because we didn't have the inner fortitude. That's kind of what this quote is here in the underneath point 6. He's saying you have to have this inner fortitude to grasp that universal logic in yourself, in your soul, and bring it out. And so when you bring it out and make it explicit to yourself, that's when you start grasping real science. This is sort of what atheism is trying to do in the realm of pure thought. But when you do it in its totality, you get back to the theory of everything. Everything is infinitely interconnected. You circle back, this knowledge inside yourself, this holographic kind of universe is in you, circles back to you. You're in this circle of reason. And he says, we were really bad at this in the past. We're using snake entrails and lots of stuff. But in a couple sessions from now, we're going to talk about the mystical again, but in a scientific way. And you'll see that there is a moment for mysticism. So the mystics in the room, don't feel totally negated. It's about sublation, remember. So now we're on point number 7. And I'm just making this point more clearly, that Hegel talks about physiognomy, which is that your physical appearance dictates how you think. Controversially, he says in the first negation, you do. If you can't be reasonable, you don't have that freedom of the idea. You actually, the way you're shaped and the colors, they actually affect things and how you interpret them. So you have to break free from that garb of colors to reach genuine philosophy, right? This kind of secular philosophy that circles back to its own sort of religion of philosophy as science. But in this mode, you don't need to use religious language. They're approximating these universal forms, the universal logic and sensuous form. So why do, you know, with the last couple of minutes here, why are atheists running away from religion? Why is it so bad? It's because the sensuousness fixes your reason, just like the physiognomy does. You can't get beyond it. You're not allowed to question it. You can't reason through it with that fluidity of the freedom of your inner child. You're sort of stuck, right? And it's oppressive. What this leads to is not being able to question the dogma. You're not allowed to question the axioms, whether they come from God or math or wherever. You're just not allowed, they're self-evident, they are the way they are. And humans, finite sensuous humans, use that unquestioning to bring in their irrationality or their drives. And this is where we sort of get not divine authority, you get human carnality. And you get child abuse. There's a lot of it in the Christian church. The Pope has been talking about it a lot in recent years after denying it. This might be a remnant from the past where we used to, I guess, have relationships with children as disciples and it was accepted. But of course, now we're aiming for something more modern where reason dictates the behavior around people. And children are regarded as not having a cultivated reason to make decisions. So that's why we're trying to set minimum ages to figure out where does reason really come in. But it's all centered around this reasoning. That's what Hegel grasped. So we want to stop that. We want to say never again. Point number 10, we teach children to think for themselves in a genuine way. Every principle and every axiom can be questioned. Why? Because every principle and every axiom can be sublated and it circles back on itself. That's what we need to teach. And it gives children the confidence to question the authorities that are maybe exploiting them or trying to take advantage of their vulnerability. We want to bring their inwardness out, which was what Protestantism was trying to do, but it didn't grasp the supersensuous version of it, the logical version of it that Hegel did. There's a couple more points here. We want to get back to this innocence and this freedom, but in a logical way. If we go back to the soul representation, you do reconnect to your soul or this like inner knowledge that you have. That's why self-determining reason is central to atheism. You can know the beyond and you don't have to go to some other external authority to do it. You can do it yourself because you aren't just doing rational thinking, you are rational. Your being is rational. It's what allows you to think rationally, and you're turning this into this rational spirit. The actual is rational, the rational is actual. It's not just in you, the world itself is the dialectical, rational, metaphysical process working through you and with you. So this is what we need to do for, and this is what atheists love. You can't trick an atheist because you're allowed to be in that first negation. You're allowed to critique, and then you're allowed to sublate that. Kant was making the mistake as the religious people. He was the one trying to separate them, right? He was in this sort of philosophical mode. He was a big philosopher right before Hegel. But he was saying, no, this reasoning is only in your head. You can never know the beyond. So he was making the truth a beyond again. And so there was this like crack that you could squeeze in kind of what you wanted, but he was trying to get away from that. So you can say, no. He was doing it in a clever way where he says, you have to find the universals in nature. And that's where he's right. But the bridge between you and nature can be sublated itself because the categories that we're interpreting the world with every day and we take for granted are the profound categories. The things he calls noumena are the thoughts themselves, pure being, something, other. These boring categories, when you see them in their right order, in their infinitely scientific, logical, super sensuous order, in their sort of perfection, the world becomes clear for you and your being moves through it in an ideal way where your children can when your inner child can kind of come out in that radical freedom. That's the point of this. You can see here in the last quote, there's no more dead externality. It's about life, right? Life is about going inward and self-determining outward. That's the sort of bridge between the atheist and religious moments, the sublation. And tomorrow we're going to talk about what that feels like, what phenomenologically that looks like when you're living in this sort of spirit in a sort of sublated religious sense. We're going to talk about presence tomorrow, maybe get into some Heidegger. And I hope you enjoy that. If you want to participate practically, take the wisdom quiz. That's how we get your wisdom to start coming out and stopping this external authority only.